Good afternoon, everyone. We're working on a crime scene investigations class. This is our crime scene analysis. We decided not to wear our masks for this presentation, although we do have them with us, just so you guys would be able to hear us a lot better throughout our presentation. Our group consists of myself, Erin Moselle,
Tia Barber,
Laura Green, Tara.
So this slide shows the beginning of our 911 call, and it's a hit and run in nature. And for this portion, we have the victim's wife calling in 911, and 911 operator is given the nature of the crime and the location. The second part of our 911 call just shows the operator trying to get signs of life out of the victim's wife and for EMS arriving on the scene. Slide 4 shows the beginning of our actions taken by the first responder. Here it shows documenting information such as reports from dispatch, initial observations, and any evidence that was gathered on the scene by the responding officer, and notes from witnesses that were in the nearby neighborhood. Our second part of actions taken by the first responder show officer safety, what was done to ensure the officer's safety, and protocols put in place to keep the integrity of the crime scene. It also shows emergency care provided to the victim by EMS.
The next part of actions taken by the first responder is secure and control the scene. The important parts to notice on this page is the primary focal points, the entry and exit points, and secondary scenes. Our primary focal point is the crime scene itself, and our secondary scene is where the suspect shot himself from running away from the police. The next thing is to talk about the entry log, which is who and what they did and at the crime scene itself, and then releasing the scene. We release the scene to the local police department. The next thing is to talk about the overall processing module. On this slide is the whole thing is made up of steps 1 through 17, but this first slide is of 1 through 7. The important parts to notice on this is the entry and exit, the secondary scene, the photographs, and document the overall observation and initial operation. With the second slide, the important things to notice are the rechecks, the sketch of the scene, and releasing the scene, and conducting a formal debriefing.
Slides 10 and 11 are crime scene photos. So we have overall photos taken from our reference point, like the lightning post, and from the lines between parking spaces 5, 58, and 57. We also have our mid-range photos that show the evidence up closer, like the body, the glass, the blood on the hood of the car. And we have close-range photos of the evidence, like the footprint and with and without the measuring tape. Also the fingerprint on the steering wheel of the car. And then also here's evidence of a picture of the glass up close, which shows environmental debris present, and then also our original crime scene sketch and the triangulation sheet.
So here we begin assessing the crime scene itself. To begin, we have our team composition. We decided to use an area approach, which is where it only uses one team and they handle the entire activities found at the scene. We did this because we had a relatively small crime scene and only had one crime scene to begin with. We also had limited resources. We split up into 2 teams, which consisted of the photography team, which was Tara and Tia, and then we had the search team, which consisted of Rosie and myself. Looking at the crime scene security, when police first arrived on the scene, they encased the entire parking lot within a first perimeter. When we arrived on the scene, we generated a second perimeter, which reached from the outside median with the light post, down to spot 28, across to spot 57, back to spot 61, and then back across to the outside median, creating like a smaller square encircling all the evidence. Then we have our search patterns. We considered doing a line search, but because we didn't have that many individuals on our crime scene team, we decided to continue with a strip search. So Rosie and I conducted that. Therefore, we could do it in a smaller amount of time with a smaller amount of individuals. The equipment needed to assess our scene was a measuring tape and photography equipment. Continuing our assessment, we had to look at the potential biohazards or risks found within the scene. Because there was blood on the hood of the car and on the victim, all of our crime scene investigators had to wear personal protective equipment, such as gloves, boots, masks, eye protection, thick pants, and other protective equipment, just because with bloodborne illnesses such as HIV, AIDS, HPV, they can be transmitted through direct as well as indirect contact with blood or any other bodily fluids. In addition to this, we have a copy of our evidence log over here in the corner. Looking at the characteristics, conditions, and entrances and exits of the scene, we begin with our current scene characteristics. The parking lot was a relatively small parking lot. It was at the lower end of the neighborhood with an additional parking lot to the north of this crime scene. The crime scene occurred at approximately parking space 58, which is where the remains were found. The conditions of the crime scene, the parking lot was generally relatively plain. The spot 58 where the victim was found was shadowed over by a tree, which allowed for environmental debris to be present throughout the scene covering the asphalt. There was also broken glass present. It was found behind, just next to the heel of the victim. It's believed to be from the headlight of the car. And then there was also a footprint that was found near the light post, and it's believed to be from the offender when he was fleeing the scene. Environmental conditions upon arrival, the entire scene was dry. It was approximately 71 degrees with a few clouds. Overall, it was sunny with a slight breeze. And then when it comes to the entry and exit, there was one main entrance and exit for vehicle traffic, which is where our vehicle for the hit and run came from. In addition to this, there was a sidewalk leading to the parking lot, to and from the parking lot, which was believed the path that the offender took when he was fleeing the scene. Now we move on to the blood pattern, which in our crime scene was impact splatter, from where the individual was hit with the car, their blood splatter went on the hood of the car. We used the Mayer test, which was to test for hemoglobin, then the luminol test, which interacts with hemoglobin and emits like a blue glow. And then we also use alternative light sources just to reveal things like seminal fluid, saliva, and urine stains. From here, you can see different directionality on each of these blood splatter portions. For example, on this one where there's trails from it, the impact would be from the opposite direction. And in order to determine the angle of impact for each droplet, we would take the width of each drop divided by the length of each drop, and whatever that result is, we would multiply it by the inverse sine, which would provide us the angle at which the drop hit the hood of the car.
This is our impression evidence, and this is the footprint that we found at the scene of the crime. So it was cast using dental stone, and we took pictures of it in oblique lighting using a scale and pictures without scale. So this is my sketch of the overall crime scene. At the top, I put which way north is going, and then our reference points are the light pole, the line between 58 and 59, and the line between 57 and 58, which are all marked on the sketch. And then A through E is our evidence. A is the footprint in the gravel. B is the fingerprint on the hood. C is the fingerprint on the wheel. C is the blood on the hood. D is the glass on the asphalt. And E is the body. And I measured out the length and drew them here of the distance between the reference points and the distance between each piece of evidence and the reference points.
There are many different ways to process fingerprints. Some ways are impression powder, the magnetic, and iodine printing. This slide shows two pictures of fingerprints that we found at the scene. The first picture is using the iodine printing, where you take crystals and you literally put it in a bag and use the fingerprint, and then you shake the bag and it comes out, the fingerprint comes out yellow. The second one is using carbon base and a magnetic brush technique. The first point on this slide talks about the use of light technology. with this, you can uses alternate lining sources, oblique lining, and a Rusu system. The Rusu system is the most used in crime scenes. It converts UV light to visible light, and it has short wavelength, and the color turns black when the light is used the right way. For the second part on the slide is the part about talking about fingerprints on the previous slide, which are the prints themselves are like two prints. The first photo is hard to tell the pattern on, but the second one, I could barely tell, but I could come up with a roll pattern. But the first pic may have a dot on it, and the second one has a purification. And then the third point is about the APIS system. The APIS system literally uses a encoding process and searches for prints to match with other prints that are within criminal records of criminals.
So now we've moved on to the shooting scene documentation, beginning with internal ballistics. Those are the study of what happens within the barrel of a weapon from the moment that the firing pin hits the primer to the bullets exit from the weapon's barrel. The focus of these studies includes propeller pressures, accelerations of the missile while within the bore, muzzle velocity, and recoil. These studies are conducted by forensic firearm examiners within a crime lab. External ballistics are the study of what occurs during the projectile's flight by evaluating various scenes aspects, such as penetrations and perforations, casings, and known positions of the victim or the shooter. This allows for the identification of possible and impossible paths that the bullet could have taken. These studies are commonly conducted by the crime scene analyst, but they can also receive help by a firearm examiner. Last on this slide, we have terminal ballistics, which are the study of behaviors and effects of a bullet projectile when it hits and transfers energy to a target, most commonly a person. The bullet design and the velocity impact are two main determinants of the effectiveness of the projectile itself. These studies are conducted by a forensic pathologist, and they are typically to trace the path of a bullet throughout the body and assess the damages caused by the bullet, as well as they differentiate between the entry and the exit wounds. Looking into the chemical processes of identifying bullet defects, this top bullet here discusses how you would determine the presence of metallic lead. You would use a 15% glacial acetic acid, and you would put it on a piece of paper that is twice the size of the defect. You would place the paper itself in the solution and then onto the defect itself. Once removing it, you would spray it with sodium rhodonate. When that happens, the paper will turn into a scarlet color. This test itself has a second backup, just to double check. And if you spray it with hydrochloric acid, the paper will then turn blue, confirming that metallic lead is present. The second one here discusses the presence of copper. You would use a 2 to 5 dilution of nitroso to 1 to naphthol. You put it on a piece of paper that's twice the size of the defect, place it on the defect, and then use a 0.2% dichloroxamide and ethanol, and this would turn the paper green if the copper is present. So on this slide, you can see the impact. You would determine the impact angle. One would take the width of the defect itself, divide it by the length, and then multiply the result by the inverse sign, which would give you the angle of impact. Looking at the direction, to determine the directionality of a bullet, one must determine if the impact point is a bullet hole, and then once that's been determined, the crime scene analyst would insert a trajectory rod using centering guides to level the rod in the defect and into a perforating defect. They would then use an angle finder to determine the angle of trajectory. The rod can then extend out to demonstrate the distance of the angle of trajectory, but if it needs to reach a farther distance, they also have little laser pointers that they can attach. The distance is found by forensic firearm examiners. They would then use a weapon similar weapon and ammunition to recreate the gunpowder residue standards at different distances. These are then compared to question residue. A forensic pathologist would determine the approximate range by studying the characteristics of the wound, and they would place it in one of the following categories. The close contact would be immediately pressed to the skin. Loose contact is a small gap between Near contact is not more than 5 inches from the wound. An intermediate range is 5 to 40 inches away from the wound, and an indeterminate range would show no characteristics, so no conclusion could be drawn.
This slide here shows a ballistics scenario that incorporates the shooting and the bullets from the previous slides. This narrative shows the suspect shooting at officers when they roll up to arrest him. He pulls out a 9mm handgun and starts shooting, but unfortunately he ends up shooting himself in the process. And this slide talks about the body. EMS did what they could when they got on the scene, which would include looking for signs of life, such as a pulse in major arteries, a heartbeat, respiration, and stuff similar to that. As after EMS did their job and the victim was on their way to the hospital, this slide also talks about stuff that the crime scene tech did, which would include documenting injuries on the wife. And because the victim also unfortunately ended up dying, this slide also shows an autopsy portion, and this talks about what the medical examiner did regarding photographs of the body.
This is our crime scene analysis. So our case was a hit and run on the corner of Rivers Parkway and Rikers Drive on November 9th. Our question is, why did the suspect choose the couple as a victim? Our first hypothesis is that the suspect was not paying attention while driving. Our second hypothesis is that the suspect had chosen them like an obsession, or he was having an affair with the victim's wife. Our data for hypothesis 2 is the footprint in the gravel, witness statements, abandoned car not far from the crime scene, fingerprints in the car, and the suspect fled from the scene. Our data for hypothesis 2 is that the suspect fled the scene, witness statements, the footprint at the scene, fingerprints found at the scene, blood on the hood of the car when found. The phone was taken from the victim's belongings at the hospital after the victim had died before he went to the medical examiner. Our predictions for hypothesis 1 is that the suspect was distracted by the phone or the radio and that it was an accidental hit and run. The predictions for hypothesis 2 was that it was an obsession that the suspect knew the victims before the hit and run had happened, and the suspect killed himself before we got to know why. Our test prediction for hypothesis 1 was that found evidence like a footprint on the radio, a fingerprint, and that there were signs in the car that the CSI team could notice if the suspect was distracted. That hypothesis was refuted. Our test predictions for hypothesis 2 was the relationship between the victim's wife and the suspect through a background check of history, because it happened to be a person that had visited the home, and how it was the husband that was injured and passed away. That hypothesis is supported. So our opinion is that the crime scene was never solved due to the suspect running away and dying from accidentally shooting himself while running away from police. And these are pictures of our flowchart of the crime scene analysis. Our entomology evidence is the study of insects. So forensics entomologists use different insects that can be found post-mortem of the body, meaning in the body, around, or on top of the body eating it. Some examples are flies and larvae, which is the easiest to collect, and preserved specimens are collected in ethyl or isopropyl alcohol. And the elements that are important are whether the area is shaded or sunlit, how much light it gets in a day, and weather conditions and the conditions of the body itself.
This concludes our crime scene analysis. Thank you for watching. Have a great rest of your day.